Hi, my name is Jen Balava. I am a naturalist with the Burlington County Park System. The following is a presentation I made to educate the residents of Burlington County all about pollinators. Pollination is an essential part of reproduction in plants that produce seeds. I would like to share with you this quote from Bob Fulcher of Tennessee State Parks. He said, "Because we appreciate the colors, forms, and fragrances of some flowers, we think we've gotten the message. In fact, much of the communication between plants and animals is easily missed, the code broken only by botanists and ecologists devoted to deciphering information intended for insects and birds." And so that is why I decided to create this presentation, to provide an intriguing glimpse into all the ways that plants communicate with the animal pollinators they need for survival. Plants that do not use animals for pollination, for the most part, use wind to spread their pollen from one plant to another. Good examples of wind-pollinated plants are many of our common trees, including conifers like pines and cedars, as well as oak, beech, birch, and sweet gum. Grasses are mostly wind-pollinated as well. And really any other wildflowers that have inconspicuous green flowers with no scent. A fantastic example of this is ragweed. This is a close-up of ragweed flowers. They produce massive amounts of pollen that contribute to our fall allergies. Unfortunately, because ragweed is inconspicuous and blooms at the same time as goldenrod, which is very conspicuous, goldenrod has often taken the blame for our fall allergies when it is in fact the ragweed that is at fault. So, in general, our wind-pollinated plants have green, inconspicuous flowers that produce copious amounts of pollen that isn't sticky, in the hopes that some of the pollen grains land on that of another of the same species. Interestingly enough, wind-pollinated trees will flower before their leaves unfold, which would block the movement of air around the flowers. So the rest of the time we're going to be talking about animal pollinators. And in contrast to wind-pollinated plants, these plants have very conspicuous flowers, bright colors, and they produce pollen that sticks. And that's important for sticking to the insect or bird that visits it. And in order to attract the insect or bird, they usually offer some kind of reward in the form of food. And most of the time that is nectar. So nectar is mostly a complex of carbohydrates, which insects need for a fast flight. And in the case of bees, only bees, these insects actually specifically collect pollen to feed their young. So pollen is mostly protein plus fats, vitamins, and minerals. And for the most part, other than bees, insects are coming to the flower for nectar, and in the process of going to the nectar, they brush up against the pollen and inadvertently transfer pollen from one plant to another. Whereas bees are specifically visiting flowers for pollen to feed their young. So it's important that the nectar is hidden deep inside a flower, otherwise the pollinators might not brush up against the pollen. They might get the reward without collecting the pollen. So it's important that the nectar is hidden deep in the flower so that pollinators must brush up against the pollen, and it also prevents evaporation and dilution from rain. In some cases, there are flowers whose nectar sources are hidden from view from the pollinators. So in these cases, there are things known as nectar guides, which literally guide the insect to where the nectar is. And a lot of times you'll see these in the form of lines in the case of the iris, or dots in the case of the foxglove. And these are guiding insects directly to where they need to go when the nectar source is hidden So our animal pollinators in our area include these groups of insects. So it's bees, wasps, butterflies, moths, some species of flies, and some species of beetles. These are our primary pollinators. We have one other animal pollinator in our area, and that is the ruby-throated hummingbird, which is specific to certain kinds of flowers that fit its beak. So we're going to look at the examples of that in just a bit. So for the most part in our area, it's the group of insects that you see on this slide that are our animal pollinators. Of course, there are other animal pollinators throughout the world. For instance, in tropical areas, there are bats that visit flowers that open at night and smell musty. They pollinate things like wild bananas and cacti. We don't have fruit bats here. We only have insect-eating bats. So those are not pollinators here in New Jersey. There are some mammals in other parts of the world that also visit flowers for nectar and in the process transfer pollen. So unbelievably, it's at least 85% of the world's flowering plants that depend on animals for pollination. In our area, that's these insects. So here you see examples of butterflies, various beetles, flies. These are all pollinators. On this slide, we see examples of bees on the top row and wasps on the bottom row. So you can tell bees and wasps apart from looking at their overall body shape. Bees have a hairier body and are generally wider in the middle. Because bees collect pollen to feed their young, they have special adaptations to collect pollen. So they have extra hairy body so that pollen sticks all over them. And they even have special branched hairs that hold pollen better, and even things known as pollen baskets on their legs, which you can see really well in the picture in the top left. Therefore, bees are considered the most efficient pollinators. Bees are vegetarians throughout their entire lives. In comparison, the wasps are less hairy and have a sort of pinched-in part between the thorax and the abdomen. While they do visit flowers for nectar for themselves and inadvertently pick up pollen in the act, they do not collect pollen specifically like bees do, because they don't feed pollen to their young. They are carnivorous and feed their young insects. The majority of the bee species in our area are actually solitary bees that do not have a stinger. There's no reason to. They don't have a hive to defend. They nest singly in holes in the ground, as you can see here. And most of them are active right now in the early spring, making these little sand mounds in the ground. These solitary bees are very important pollinators of many of our early wildflowers and some of our spring crops. Next we have bald-faced hornets. These are common in our area, and it's important to recognize them from other insects. They make a gray pendant-shaped papier-mâché looking nest from wood fibers that they mix with their saliva. If you leave them and their nest alone, they will leave you alone. But if you try to attack or spray them or harm them in any way, they will definitely attack and sting aggressively. We have these in trees all throughout our county parks, and no one really seems to notice them until the leaves fall off the trees, and then people complain and want them removed, when in fact the whole year long they were not a problem to anyone because they were left alone. If you have these on the side of your house or other kind of occupied dwelling, then you should definitely have them professionally removed. Otherwise, let them be. These insects are doubly beneficial. In spring and summer, these hornets will bring in various kinds of insect protein, mostly in the form of flies and yellow jackets, which they will feed to their young. The adults also drink flower nectar and can act as pollinators of some plants. So our insect pollinators are not only attracted by color, but very often by smell. So insects can be attracted to a flower by a particular kind of scent that the plant produces, whereas birds don't really have a sense of smell. They have excellent eyesight and are more attracted to color, but not scent. So, therefore, most bird-pollinated flowers are tubular shaped to fit the head of the bird and don't have a scent. So, as you can see here, it's the diverse signals by which plants attract pollinators that lead to this incredible diversity of both flower color and shape that we see today. And this is just an example in this chart of how certain shapes, colors, and scents can attract different groups of pollinators. So, for instance, beetles, which are not very agile flyers, need a large, shallow, bowl-shaped flower to land on, and they're attracted to a dull, white colored flower with a strong scent. And examples of that would be water lilies and magnolias. And so for each of these groups, you can see there's certain kinds of characteristics that attract them. Butterflies, for instance, don't like to feed while hovering in midair. So they like a tube with a rim for them to land on, and they're attracted to very vivid colors. Whereas moths are generally out at night, and the color is really not important, but the scent is much more important. So this is very important for understanding how plants attract certain groups of pollinators. So these are examples of typical hummingbird pollinated flowers. The trumpet honeysuckle, which is native, you see on the left, and trumpet creeper, which is an exotic invasive vine on the right. These have long tubular flowers that are bright red and no scent, which definitely attracts hummingbirds. These are examples of moth-pollinated flowers. You can see evening primrose in the top right, moth mullein on the bottom right. These are both opening towards the evening with a strong scent and a bright, white pale flower. And then we also have a really unusual wildflower that I wanted to share. This is crane flight orchid. You can see the whole flower in the top left and a close-up of the flowers in the middle. And if we take a look at it even closer, you can see it has this long tube, and the nectar is held all the way in the back of that nectar tube. So this flower requires a pollinator with a very long tongue. And we have such pollinators here in Burlington County, and this is one of them. This is the pink spotted hawk moth, which has a ridiculously long tongue. It's about 4 inches long, so plenty long enough to pollinate crane flight orchid. And these are examples of typical plants that are pollinated by butterflies. So notice they have a tube with a little rim for the butterflies to land on. So you see examples here of butterfly bush, milkweed, and verbena. And they are very, very bright, conspicuous colors with some scent. So these are typical butterfly flowers. So in my personal quest to photograph southern New Jersey wildflowers, I have documented them in folders on my hard drive by flower color. And originally I noticed there are a lot of white and yellow and pink and not a lot of the other colors. So it wasn't until I got more into understanding pollinators that I realized the significance of this. So amazingly enough, The reason why there's so many white, yellow, and pale pink flowers in nature is because those are the colors that are most visible to the largest variety of insect pollinators. The other colors we really don't see until later in the year when there are lots of insects out and some flowers can be more selective of their pollinators. And we know that green flowers are not pollinated by insects, they're pollinated by wind. And red mostly by the hummingbird or butterflies. So there's not as many of those as compared to the other species. And this is very important for understanding the times of year when there aren't a lot of insects, like in the early spring and then again in the late fall. If you look around in the environment at that time, for instance with spring ephemerals come up and have to pretty much do everything in about 2 weeks' time before their light is taken up by the trees that leaf out above them. So they need to make sure they're pollinated in that short amount of time. So all of our spring ephemerals are white, yellow, or pale pink to ensure they're seen by the limited variety of insects that are out at that time. And the same thing happens again in late fall. If you look around, what do you see? A whole bunch of pastel flowers, mostly white and yellow, in fields because there's less insects flying around at that time. So our animal pollinators see very differently from us. Most of our insect species have just 2 types of color pigment receptors. They're known as bichromatic, and that vision isn't very good for detecting color. They mainly see the pastel colored flowers against a darker background, and that's why there's all those white and yellow flowers. And then we have insects with trichromatic vision, or 3 types of color pigment receptors. And these include bees, wasps, butterflies, moths, and us. But bees and wasps see very differently from us. Their vision is shifted. They can't see red, but they can see into the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, which we're going to look at next on the next slide. Butterflies and moths as a group vary widely in their sensitivity to light. In fact, butterflies have the largest range of color vision in the insect kingdom. In recent research, they found that butterfly eyes are remarkably complex. There's evidence of 3, 4, and even 5 color pigment receptors in most butterflies. And they found one species, the blue bottle butterfly in Australia, that has 15 color pigment receptors. In another study at the University of Washington, they found that the 3 common types of cones in the human retina can distinguish about 100 intensities of light, resulting in about 1 million discrete colors that we can see. Whereas a butterfly that has 5 color pigment receptors is capable of distinguishing up to 10 billion colors. And finally, we have the tetrachromatic birds. And these are species that have 4 types of color pigment receptors. And that's most of our birds. This chart shows the electromagnetic spectrum. This shows all the energy wavelengths from the strongest, which are gamma rays, all the way on the left, to the weakest energy and the longest wavelengths, radio waves. You can see that it's just a very small portion of the spectrum that we can perceive as visible light, which is red to violet. And that corresponds to 700 to 400 nanometer wavelengths. So if we compare that to insect pollinators, you can see insects with bichromatic vision see just a small range of visible light, which is why they're attracted to pale flowers against a relatively dark background. They really don't see a range of color. And then bees have trichromatic vision, and you can see their vision is shifted left. So it goes from yellow to ultraviolet. And then we have moths, which they have their vision shifted even further left, and that spans from about green to UV. And then we have the butterflies, which have the largest range of vision of insects, spanning from red deep into the UV. So if we look at everything all together, you can see all of them here for comparison. So plants can actually target or avoid different subsets of pollinators by signaling in different parts of the spectrum. So in flowers that are signaling to insects that can perceive ultraviolet, there's a region of low ultraviolet reflectance near the center and very high UV reflectance on the outside of each petal. Now, of course, that's invisible to us because we can't see ultraviolet, but this pattern acts like a bullseye pattern, and it helps the bee locate the flower's center. So what you're going to see in this next section is very special ultraviolet reflectance photography by my husband Damon, and he used very special modified camera to capture these images. He had to use also a special lens that allows ultraviolet to pass through, and a special filter that blocks all light except for UV. And then even after all that, it still has to be post-processed in software to correct for white balance and colors. So what you're going to see here is a selection of certain flowers that have hidden ultraviolet patterns. So this is like a bee's eye view of certain flowers that we have around here. So we'll start with the dandelion. So here it is, regular visible light, and then here it is with ultraviolet reflectance photography. Amazing. Let's look at another one. This is trout lily. This is one of our spring ephemerals. It just looks plain yellow to us, but to a bee, an incredible hidden bullseye. All right, this is trailing arbutus. This is a spring wildflower in the pinelands. It looks just pastel here, but in UV, very different. Then we have hedge bindweed, a very common morning glory, with its varied pattern here in visible light. And UV. This is one of my favorites. This is mountain laurel. Watch the center of each flower. So in each case, we see low UV reflectance in the center and high reflectance at the outside, creating that bullseye pattern. And finally, we have black-eyed Susan. This has one of the most dramatic patterns of all the UV pictures you've seen here. So we have the standard native black-eyed Susan and one rustic cultivar. It's amazing. All right. This is a scan from National Geographic magazine showing all the different shapes of pollen grains and These fit like a puzzle piece into the plant tissue that they are meant to fertilize. So here are some more pictures showing different examples of pollen grains and how variable they are. So plants can recognize and ignore pollen from another plant species, and in some cases, they can even tell the difference between a pollen grain produced by themselves and one from another individual of their species, in order to avoid self-fertilization. Some plants are very selective of their pollinators, while others are generalists and allow many kinds of insects to collect nectar and pollen. So, to not waste pollen that won't be transferred to the same species, some flowers hold nectar in such a way that only one kind or just a few kinds of insects have access to it. But that, of course, is risky because if one disappears, so does the other. So we're going to look at some amazing pollination strategies in this next section. So first we're going to look at an amazing pollination strategy of alfalfa. Alfalfa is a type of clover, and its stamens and pistil, that's the male and female reproductive parts of the flower, they're hidden behind a keel. So it's not readily visible to an insect when it visits. So certain bees know just how to land on this flower, and when the bee does, it lands on the keel and its weight trips a mechanism which causes the spring-loaded stamens and pistil to launch upward and clock the bee in the chin. Now this seems kind of silly, but it's a great strategy because alfalfa grows in a field with lots of other flowers. So that bee can visit lots of other species and the pollen is tucked safely under its chin until it comes in contact with another alfalfa flower where the pollen will then be removed once the stamens come in contact with the bee's chin again. So this strategy is pretty cool and it works great with bumblebees and some of our solitary bees, but not with honeybees who don't like to get punched in the chin. They don't visit alfalfa flowers, they don't pollinate them. In mountain laurel, you can see the anthers are actually pressed down into little pockets. And you can even see it from the side view. They're actually sticking out from the side of the flower. So the anthers are waiting for insects to brush up against them. So in this picture you can tell insects haven't been to the flower yet. But in this picture you can see the difference. So on the right, the anthers are still pushed down into the pockets, indicating that no insects have been there yet. And then on the left you can see in this particular flower, the anthers are all in the center, and so this flower has been pollinated. Tomatoes and many other members of the nightshade family have no nectar in their flowers, and they keep their pollen grains hidden inside pores in the anthers. So there's not many insects that can pollinate these flowers. But there are some bumblebees that know just how to land on the flower, grab the filaments with their legs and mouth, and then vibrate their wing muscles. And when their vibrating wings reach just the right frequency, the pollen grains will pop out of the anthers and transfer to the bee. This is known as buzz pollination, and that's how our tomatoes and eggplants and peppers are pollinated in greenhouses. Flowers of carnivorous plants, like pitcher plants, are tall and on completely separate stalks to avoid catching their pollinators, as you can see here. Skunk cabbage emerges in February. It's the earliest wildflower in North America to bloom. It doesn't look like a normal flower at all. As you can see, it looks like a really strange structure. It's maroon, and it can actually generate heat and melt snow. So the strategy here is that the color and the putrid scent attracts flies that think it's some kind of rotting flesh, some animal that didn't make it through the winter. And those flies will go to lay their eggs inside there and instead get tricked into pollinating the flower. Jack in the pulpit is a relatively common plant in the arum family that we see in the woods in Burlington County. And there are separate male and female plants. The male plant has a little ring of flowers at the bottom of this structure here that you see, and those flowers only contain pollen. So hopefully some insects will get tricked into the tube. The tube has downward facing hairs and the insects must go down. They can only get out through an exit hole at the bottom of that tube. So a few days later, the female plant will emerge, which is much larger and has a different ring of flowers, and those flowers will accept the pollen. But the problem is that the female plant doesn't have an exit hole, so the pollinators are taken prisoner, and they will die at the bottom of the structure. So pretty brutal murdering of pollinators in the Jack in the Pulpit. So after pollination is complete, the plant must signal again to the pollinators to indicate that they're no longer needed. And this is an incredible magic act. Sometimes the plant will indicate this by simply drying up the nectar, or the flower will fade, droop, close, the scent will fade, and sometimes the flower will even change color. So this is really incredibly efficient because it sends the pollinators where their work will do the most good, and the pollinators aren't wasting their time going to flowers that don't have anything for them. So here are some examples of color changes in flowers to indicate pollination is complete. In this picture, we see that the color of the nectar guides in horse chestnut flowers change from yellow to reddish pink when nectar is no longer available. And here we see tick trefoils. So this is a group of plants in the clover family that will normally have 3 pink petals, but they change rapidly from pink to this turquoise color when pollination is complete. And this is one of my favorite things to look for in the fall. The color of the discs on members of the aster genus in September and October turn from a bright yellow to this brownish purple after pollination is complete. So you can look at these flowers and see which ones have been pollinated and which ones have not. It's pretty fun to look for at that time of year, and you'll see the insects always going to those that have the yellow center. So now that you've learned all these really cool things about pollinators, hopefully you care a little bit more about them, because pollinators are in a lot of trouble worldwide. Honeybees are bees that were brought here from Europe in the 1600s with the European settlers, and they're now indispensable part of our agricultural food supply. They are responsible for pollinating about 1/3 of our food, which actually comes out to be more than 100 different types of crops. Unfortunately, honeybees, like a lot of other kinds of pollinators right now, are declining very rapidly. Honeybees are undergoing colony collapse disorder, which continues to kill honeybees in very large numbers every year. What happens with this is that basically their immune system is compromised as a result of many different factors, but mostly chlorinated nicotine pesticides known as neonicotinoids, which makes them susceptible to other naturally occurring infections. So, as I just mentioned, honeybees are undergoing colony collapse disorder. Our native bumblebees are susceptible to exotic fungal diseases. This is due to mainly being raised commercially for greenhouse pollination. Bumblebees are transported far and wide across North America and Europe, and the global trade in domesticated bumblebees for crop pollination, such as tomatoes and peppers, has resulted in the introduction of a non-native parasite from Europe. So the stressed out bumblebees often carry these deadly parasites in their guts, which they then pass on to native wild bumblebees. And so if you take all these things into account, the exposure to these insects of various cocktail of different types of insecticides, combined with, of course, habitat loss, there's no reason to wonder why pollinators are in such decline. There are examples of situations around the world where the pollinators of a certain crop are now extinct. And that means that these crops have to all be pollinated by hand. These are some examples. Pear trees in China, they have to be pollinated by workers who dip bamboo sticks with chicken feathers wrapped around them, dip them into plastic bottles of pollen, and then touch every stick to each individual pear blossom, hand pollinating billions of flowers. This is an extremely inefficient process. There's all kinds of articles and videos you can find of the workers doing this. Vanilla orchids in Mexico. These vanilla orchid flowers only open one day and have a flap protecting the pollen. There was only one kind of bee that had the ability to manipulate that flap, but forest deforestation, habitat loss has led to their demise in Mexico. Since there's no other pollinators that master the trick, all vanilla orchids have to be hand pollinated by humans. And the same situation with the passion fruit industry in Brazil, where laborers have to hand pollinate the flowers due to the loss of the native carpenter bees. So a world without pollinators equals a flowerless landscape where only wind-pollinated plants dominate. That means green flowers, no color, and lots of airborne pollen. We would have a completely dysfunctional food system for not only us, but for many other animals as well, because the act of pollination results in fruits and seeds. You can help our native pollinators by planting a bee-friendly garden. Native perennials are the ideal choice of plants, and the more shapes, colors, and different seasonal blooming times of the flowers, the more kinds of insects will be supported throughout their life cycle. These plants must be certified as pesticide-free. Planting a hedgerow of trees and shrubs is also a great way to provide habitat in a small linear area. Grasses and sedges also provide shelter and nesting sites, and even overwintering sites. And there are also host plants for skipper butterflies. So planting a bee-friendly garden is a great way to make a difference. This is really only true for native plants. Ornamental varieties certainly look pretty, but they often have little habitat and food value for our native pollinators. And that's because the floral structures have been extremely modified. So sometimes there's no pollen or nectar sources at all, and they can't manipulate the flowers properly, and the UV patterns may no longer be present. So the garden should have the least amount of disturbance to the soil for the ground nesters. And it's actually about 70% of our native bees that are solitary ground nesters. So heavy wood chips or colored treated wood chips are not good for ground nesters. They just require small patches of undisturbed ground. Often sandy or mossy areas are perfect. About 30% of our native bees are wood nesters. And these insects use mostly hollow plant stems and dead trunks. The female solitary bee will deposit one egg with a mass of pollen and then a mud wall, and repeat the process until the cells are filled in the hollow tube. So many of these wood nesters are mason bees. There are also carpenter bees that use wood to nest in too, and can be deterred from nesting in your furniture or deck by hanging blocks of wood with holes already drilled in them to lay their eggs in. Mud, pebbles, plant fibers, and plant resins all benefit many kinds of pollinators in their nest building. And then, of course, they need a water source, which could be a pond, puddle, even muddy areas. The most useful is a shallow saucer of water, which isn't as deep as a bird bath. Bird baths are normally too deep for most insects to use. These are examples of insect hotels for native cavity nesting bees to live in. The key with these is that they must have a door or some kind of hinge that allows you to remove the nesting material and put new material in once the young bees have emerged, usually in the springtime. If you leave the old material inside, then you can actually do more harm than good, since the holes can develop fungus, which is lethal to the developing insects. So look for ones that can be opened in the back. If you look at the picture on the right, this is an example of the insect hotel that was built by an Eagle Scout at Longbridge Park in Hainesport. And you can see we actually used a lot of the invasive reeds right from the meadow as nesting material for the native bees. It's pretty cool. So other than planting a bee-friendly garden, you can also help by supporting our local beekeepers by buying honey and other hive products from them, and obviously using less or no pesticides, and certainly do not use any of the chlorinated nicotines, anything in the neonicotinoid group like imidacloprid or anything related to it. And mainly just educate as many people as you can about pollinators. So I hope that this presentation has been both intriguing and informative and inspires you to care about our pollinators. Please do your part to ensure that our bees and other pollinators are not harmed unnecessarily and can continue to provide such an important free service for us and the natural world. Feel free to share this video link with others. Please do not copy or download any images in the presentation. Thank you for watching.